Get your dirty black hands off him, you animal! Dr. Richard Sterling's face contorted with pure hatred as he towered over Grace Williams. She knelt beside unconscious CEO Michael Davis, her skilled fingers finding the rapid pulse that screamed sepsis. Hospital staff formed a circle, phones capturing every humiliating second. "Look at this," Sterling announced to his audience. "The monkey thinks she's playing doctor." He grabbed Grace's wrist, yanking her away from Michael like she was infected. "You people belong in the basement, not touching white patients." His designer shoes stepped on her leather medical notebook, grinding 20 years of expertise into the marble floor. Grace's voice stayed steady despite the storm. "Doctor, he needs immediate blood cultures. The petechial rash indicates—" "Shut up!" Sterling's spit landed on her cheek. "Your ghetto voodoo killed enough people already. Security!" As white-gloved hands dragged her away, Grace locked eyes with Sterling. "When he dies in 2 hours, remember, I could have saved him." The crowd cheered Sterling's victory, but Grace's prophecy had already begun. 2 hours later, Michael Davis lay dying in the ICU, and Dr. Richard Sterling was starting to sweat. Grace pushed her cleaning cart through the hospital corridors, her movements mechanical while her mind raced. Every instinct screamed that Michael's collapse wasn't random. She'd seen this pattern before, the sudden onset, the specific rash, the way his body had fought against itself. "Grace, you okay?" Maria Santos, her young cleaning partner, whispered as they passed the nurse's station. "Everyone's talking about what happened upstairs." Grace's jaw tightened. She'd endured worse than Sterling's public humiliation, but the echo of monkey still burned in her chest. "I'm fine, mija. Just focused on work." But work meant more than mopping floors. Grace's leather notebook emerged from her uniform pocket, cracked and worn from years of secret documentation. Inside, meticulous handwriting recorded everything the medical staff missed: patient behaviors, environmental changes, infection patterns that only someone who cleaned every room could see. Room 302. Mrs. Henderson, post-surgical, complained of nausea yesterday. Grace had noted the unusual metallic smell in her room. Room 318. Mr. Patel, cardiac patient, skin looked ashen this morning. His IV site showed early signs of inflammation. Room 325. Jennifer Walsh, pneumonia recovery, mentioned feeling off during Grace's midnight cleaning round. 3 patients, 3 different floors, all showing subtle signs that the medical charts missed. Grace's pen moved across the page as she walked, connecting dots that no one else could see. The timeline was clear. All symptoms started after the new ventilation system came online last week. She'd watched the installation crew work, noted how they'd rushed the job, cutting corners to meet the hospital's aggressive deadline. "Excuse me." Dr. Jennifer Park, a young resident, caught Grace near the elevator. Unlike the other doctors, Park had always treated Grace with respect. "I wanted to thank you for what you tried to do for Mr. Davis earlier." Grace studied the young woman's face. Park looked exhausted, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of mysterious cases flooding the emergency room. "Dr. Park, can I ask you something?" Grace kept her voice low. "Have you noticed any patterns in the recent admissions? Similar symptoms, maybe unusual presentations?" Park's eyes sharpened. "Actually, yes. We've had several patients with atypical infections. Dr. Sterling thinks it's just seasonal variants, but—" She paused, glancing around. "Why do you ask?" Grace opened her notebook, showing Park the careful observations she'd recorded. The young doctor's eyes widened as she read entries that painted a clearer picture than any medical chart. "This is incredible documentation," Park whispered. "You've tracked environmental factors, patient behaviors, timing. How did you—" 20 years of watching," Grace said simply. "When you're invisible, you see everything." Park studied the timeline Grace had created. "These patients all share the same air circulation system, the new ventilation network that connects the East Wing to the executive floors. Which means whatever infected Mr. Davis is spreading," Grace confirmed. And if I'm right about the source, we have maybe 6 hours before it becomes an outbreak. Dr. Park's hands trembled as she closed the notebook. Grace, I need to tell Dr. Sterling about this immediately. He won't listen to you if it comes from me. Then I won't mention you. I'll present it as my own observations. Grace shook her head. That's not how this works, Doctor. The truth has a way of coming out, and when it does, you don't want to be caught in a lie. Before Park could respond, Sterling's voice boomed across the nurse's station. Dr. Park, where's that culture report on Davis? Park shot Grace an apologetic look and hurried away, leaving Grace alone with her notebook and a growing sense of dread. She continued her rounds, but now every room told a story of impending crisis. The ventilation system hummed overhead, circulating more than just air. In the executive wing, she passed Michael's office where everything had started. The cleaning supplies Sterling had accused her of contaminating the scene sat exactly where she'd left them, untouched, proving his accusation false. But proof meant nothing when the messenger was a black woman with a mop. Grace made her way to the basement maintenance area, a place where the hospital's elite never ventured. Here, among the pipes and machinery that kept St. Catherine's running, she found the ventilation intake valve for the east wing. Her trained eye spotted what the installation crew had missed, a loose seal that allowed moisture to accumulate, creating the perfect breeding ground for bacteria. She documented everything with her phone, then made careful notes in her notebook. The evidence was overwhelming, but getting anyone to listen would require a miracle. Her radio crackled to life. All cleaning staff went to the ICU immediately. We need a deep sanitation protocol. Grace's heart sank. It was starting. She arrived at the ICU to find chaos. 3 more patients had developed symptoms identical to Michael's. Dr. Sterling moved between rooms like a general commanding troops, barking orders that addressed symptoms but ignored the source. Broad-spectrum antibiotics for everyone, Sterling commanded. I want cultures on everything. Blood, urine, sputum, and get environmental services up here to sterilize every surface. Grace stepped forward, her notebook clutched tight. Dr. Sterling, I may have information about the source of these infections. The entire medical team turned to stare. Sterling's face cycled through surprise, anger, and finally contempt. Did someone forget to escort this woman off hospital property? Sterling's voice carried through the ICU like a slap. I thought I made it clear that janitors don't practice medicine in my hospital. Please, just look at the pattern. The only pattern I see is your persistent inability to know your place. Sterling stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You people need to understand that cleaning toilets doesn't qualify you to play doctor. Your ghetto education ended when you lost your license. The words hit Grace like physical blows, but she stood her ground. Dr. Sterling, people are going to die if you don't listen. People are going to die if I waste time on your witch doctor theories. Sterling turned to security. Remove her. If she comes near any patient area again, call the police. As security approached, Grace opened her notebook one last time. The ventilation system, Dr. Sterling. Check the intake valve in the basement. You'll find your source there. But Sterling had already turned away, dismissing her words like everything else about her existence. Grace allowed herself to be escorted out, but her mind was already forming a plan. If Sterling wouldn't listen through normal channels, she'd have to find another way. Because in 6 hours, his pride would cost lives, and Grace Williams had sworn an oath long ago to first do no harm. Even if it meant saving the man who'd just called her subhuman. Grace Williams had spent 30 years learning when to fight and when to survive. Tonight, survival meant fighting. She waited in the hospital's main conference room at 6 a.m., her cleaning uniform pressed, her leather notebook centered on the polished mahogany table like evidence in a trial. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan awakened to another day, unaware that St. Catherine's Medical Center was hours away from a medical catastrophe. Dr. Richard Sterling entered with the arrogance of a man who'd never been proven wrong. His Italian leather shoes clicked against marble as he approached the table, his face already twisted with irritation. "You have exactly 5 minutes to explain why you're sitting in my conference room instead of mopping floors," Sterling said, remaining standing to assert dominance. "Then security will remove you permanently." Grace looked up at him with calm eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated by anything he could dish out. "Dr. Sterling, I have 5 conditions before I share what I've discovered." Sterling's laugh was sharp and ugly. "Conditions? You're a janitor, Grace. You don't make conditions. You follow orders." "First condition," Grace continued, her voice steady as steel. "You will listen to my complete assessment without interruption. Second condition. You will treat me as a medical professional during this conversation. Third condition. You will investigate my findings with the same rigor you'd give any doctor's report." Sterling's face flushed red. "Are you out of your mind? You lost your license because you nearly killed a patient with your incompetence. What makes you think—" Grace's hand moved to her notebook, and something in her posture made Sterling stop mid-sentence. For the first time, he noticed how she sat. Not like a frightened cleaning lady, but like someone who'd commanded respect in rooms just like this one. "Fourth condition," Grace said, her voice cutting through his bluster like a scalpel. "If I'm right about what's happening in this hospital, you will acknowledge your error publicly. Fifth condition, you will ensure that no other staff member is ever dismissed for sharing medical concerns, regardless of their position or skin color." Sterling leaned forward, his hands pressed flat on the table. "Listen carefully, you arrogant Dr. Sterling." Grace's voice carried an authority that made him pause. "We have a healthcare-associated infection outbreak beginning in this hospital. Michael Davis was patient 0, and 7 more patients have developed symptoms in the past 6 hours. If you don't listen to what I have to say, we'll have 24 confirmed cases by noon, and some of them will die." The confidence in her voice, the precision of her language, the way she handled medical terminology like someone who'd spent decades in the field, it all combined to create a moment of doubt in Sterling's mind. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "We've run every test, checked every protocol." Grace opened her notebook and slid it across the table. Sterling hesitated, then reluctantly looked down at pages filled with meticulous observations, charts, and medical notations that demonstrated a level of clinical thinking he hadn't expected. "Room 302, Mrs. Henderson. Complaint of metallic taste on Tuesday which you attributed to her medication. But look at the timing. It correlates with the new ventilation system activation. Room 318, Mr. Patel. Skin discoloration you dismissed as post-surgical bruising. But combined with his elevated temperature and the environmental timeline—" Sterling found himself actually reading Grace's entries, his medical training forcing him to recognize the quality of her observations. Her handwriting was precise, her documentation thorough, her analysis methodical. "This is comprehensive," Sterling admitted grudgingly. "But how could you possibly correlate these seemingly unrelated—" "Because I clean every room, Dr. Sterling. I see every patient, every day. I notice changes that busy doctors miss because you're focused on charts and test results instead of actually observing your patients." Grace stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city. "Yesterday morning, I documented unusual bacterial growth patterns in rooms connected to the new East Wing ventilation system. Yesterday afternoon, I discovered moisture accumulation at the intake valve in the basement, a perfect breeding ground for Legionella bacteria." Sterling's head snapped up. "Legionella?" "The incubation period matches the timeline perfectly. The symptoms fit the pattern, and the distribution follows the ventilation map exactly." Grace turned back to face him. "I've been tracking this for 3 days, Dr. Sterling. While you've been treating symptoms, I've been identifying the source." "That's—" Sterling started to object, then stopped as his phone buzzed with an urgent text. He read it, and his face went pale. "2 more patients just developed respiratory symptoms," he whispered. Grace nodded grimly. "The count is now 9. In 2 hours, it'll be 15. By tonight, if we don't shut down the contaminated system and start targeted treatment, you'll have a full-scale Legionnaire's disease outbreak." Sterling sank into his chair, the weight of the situation finally hitting him. Why should I trust you? After what happened with your license?" For the first time, Grace's composure cracked slightly. "Because, Dr. Sterling, I've spent every day of the last 2 years proving that losing my license didn't make me forget how to save lives. That wealthy family destroyed my career with their false accusations, but they couldn't take away my knowledge or my commitment to patients." She moved back to the table, placing her hands flat on its surface. "I could have let Michael Davis die last night. I could have watched this outbreak spread without saying a word. I could have let your arrogance and racism cost lives while I stayed safely in my place. But you didn't. No, I didn't. Because while you see a black janitor who should know her place, I see patients who deserve to live. And that matters more than your opinion of me." Sterling stared at the notebook, then at Grace, then at his phone, which buzzed again with another urgent update. "Environmental Services just reported finding standing water in the ventilation intake," he read aloud. They're recommending immediate system shutdown and bacterial testing." Grace's expression didn't change. "The maintenance request form was filed under my employee ID 3 hours ago. I also submitted water samples to the lab for Legionella testing. The results should be available within the hour." Sterling looked up at her with something approaching respect. "You've been building your case." "I've been doing my job, Dr. Sterling. The job I was trained for, the job I've never stopped doing, even when people like you decided I wasn't worthy of it." Sterling's phone rang. He answered with shaking hands, listened for 30 seconds, then hung up. "The lab confirmed Legionella pneumophila in your water samples," he said quietly. "The concentration levels are significant." Grace nodded. "Then you know what needs to happen next. Full system shutdown, contact isolation for affected patients, targeted antibiotic therapy, and immediate notification of the CDC." "The board will want answers," Sterling said, almost to himself. "Then you better have them ready," Grace replied. "Because, Dr. Sterling, we're about to find out whether your pride is more important than your patients' lives." Sterling looked at the notebook one more time, then at the woman who'd written it. For 30 years, he'd dismissed people like Grace as insignificant. Now one of them was offering to save his career and his patients' lives. "What do you need from me?" he asked quietly. Grace Williams smiled for the first time in days. "Just listen, Dr. Sterling, and maybe learn that wisdom doesn't always come with the credentials you expect." The transformation began in the hospital's basement, where Dr. Richard Sterling found himself following Grace Williams through maintenance corridors he'd never seen in 20 years of working at St. Catherine's. "The intake valve is here," Grace said, pointing to a junction where the new ventilation system connected to the hospital's main air circulation. Sterling crouched beside her, his pristine white coat contrasting sharply with the industrial setting. "I can see the moisture damage," he admitted, his voice carrying none of yesterday's arrogance. "The sealant wasn't properly applied." Grace opened her notebook, showing him detailed sketches she'd made of the faulty installation. "The contractors rushed the job to meet the hospital's deadline. I documented 17 safety violations during the installation process, but maintenance reports go through administration, not medical staff." Sterling studied her precise drawings, noting how she'd recorded measurements, timestamps, and even weather conditions that could affect bacterial growth. "Your documentation is more thorough than most medical students' case studies." "Experience teaches you to be thorough," Grace replied quietly. "When you're invisible, you learn to make your observations count." They worked together for the next hour, Sterling asking questions while Grace explained the environmental factors she'd tracked. Gradually, their conversation shifted from suspicion to professional collaboration. "Dr. Sterling," Grace said as they examined water samples under her portable microscope, a tool she'd purchased with her own cleaning wages. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up from the bacterial culture they were preparing. What? Why medicine? What made you want to be a doctor? Sterling paused, his hands stilling. My younger brother died of pneumonia when we were kids. The local doctor dismissed his symptoms as just a cold, until it was too late. He met her eyes. I swore I'd never let anyone die because a doctor wasn't paying attention. Grace nodded slowly. And yet yesterday, you almost did exactly that. The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. I know. Michael Davis is alive because I forced you to listen, Grace continued. But how many other patients have suffered because their concerns were dismissed by someone who thought they knew better? Sterling's voice was barely a whisper. Too many. They were interrupted by Dr. Jennifer Park, who appeared at the bottom of the maintenance stairs looking frazzled and exhausted. Dr. Sterling, we need you upstairs immediately. 3 more patients have developed symptoms and... She stopped when she saw Grace. Oh, I didn't know you were working together. We are now, Sterling said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Grace, Dr. Park has been tracking the clinical progression. Grace has identified the source and containment protocol. Dr. Park's eyes widened as Grace opened her notebook and began explaining the environmental timeline. Within minutes, Park was asking technical questions that Grace answered with the precision of someone who'd spent years studying infectious disease patterns. This is extraordinary, Park said, reading Grace's bacterial analysis. You've basically conducted a complete epidemiological investigation. Where did you learn to do this? 20 years of watching patients and reading medical journals during my breaks, Grace replied. When you lose your license, you don't lose your curiosity. Park looked between Grace and Sterling. We need to present this to the full medical team immediately. Grace, you should be the one to brief them. Sterling's jaw tightened. The medical staff won't be receptive to hearing from Grace. Then they need to learn to be, Park said firmly. Because right now she's the only one who understands what's happening. Grace shook her head. Dr. Park, I appreciate your support, but Dr. Sterling is right. Yesterday proved how the medical staff sees me. Let's focus on saving lives first, politics later. They made their way back to the main hospital where the ICU had been converted into an isolation ward. Grace watched Sterling work with his team, noting how he'd quietly incorporated her recommendations into his treatment protocols without crediting her directly. Start all patients on azithromycin, Sterling ordered, and I want respiratory therapists monitoring oxygen levels every 15 minutes. Should we notify the CDC? Asked Dr. Martinez, the chief resident. Sterling glanced at Grace, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Already done. They're sending a team to investigate the environmental source. As the medical team dispersed, Grace continued her cleaning rounds, but now her work had taken on new meaning. She wasn't just maintaining hygiene, she was conducting ongoing surveillance, watching for signs that the outbreak was contained. Maria Santos found her in the supply closet, restocking disinfectant bottles with methodical precision. Grace, is it true what they're saying? That you're the one who figured out what's making everyone sick? Grace looked at the young woman who'd become like a daughter to her over the past year. Maria worked double shifts to support her family, never complaining, always learning. We all figured it out together, Mija. Dr. Sterling, Dr. Park, the lab technicians. Medicine is a team effort. But you saw it first, Maria insisted. The nurses are talking. They say you've been tracking this for days while the doctors missed it completely. Grace paused in her restocking. Maria, what matters isn't who saw it first. What matters is that patients are getting better. It matters to me, Maria said quietly. Every night I watch you read those medical journals on your break. I see how you check on patients, how you notice things others miss. You're not just a cleaning lady, Grace. You never were. Grace felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Thank you for seeing me, Maria. I want to learn from you. Really learn. Could you teach me some of what you know?" Grace smiled and handed Maria a spare notebook from her supply cart. Observation starts with caring enough to really look. Tonight, I'll show you how to track patient patterns, environmental factors, things that matter for their recovery. In room 302, Mrs. Henderson was sitting up in bed, color returning to her cheeks. "Grace," she called out weakly, "Dr. Sterling said you're the one who figured out what was making everyone sick." Grace paused in her mopping. In all her years of cleaning, patients rarely acknowledged her presence, let alone spoke to her directly. "I just noticed some patterns, Mrs. Henderson. The doctors did the real work." "Nonsense," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "My daughter's a nurse in Chicago. She says the best diagnosticians are the people who spend time actually observing patients, not just reading charts." For the first time in years, Grace felt a spark of the pride she'd once taken in her medical work. In the next room, Mr. Patel was awake and breathing easier. When he saw Grace, he struggled to sit up straighter. "The nurse told me you saved my life," he said in accented English. "Thank you." Grace blinked back tears. "Mr. Patel, just focus on getting better." "My family, they don't trust hospitals. Too many bad experiences. But you," he searched for words. "You cared when nobody was watching. That matters." Later that evening, Grace found Dr. Sterling in his office, staring at her notebook which he'd been studying for hours. "I owe you an apology," he said without looking up. Grace took a seat across from his desk, the first time she'd ever sat in his presence rather than standing submissively. "Dr. Sterling, what you owe me is the assurance that this never happens again to anyone else." "I've been thinking about that," Sterling said. "Your documentation methodology, your environmental surveillance techniques, they could revolutionize how we approach infection control." Grace remained quiet, letting him work through his thoughts. "I want to create a position," Sterling continued. "Director of Environmental Health and Safety. Someone who bridges the gap between facilities management and medical care, who can see patterns that traditional clinical staff might miss." "That sounds like an important role," Grace said carefully. "I want to offer it to you." Grace leaned back in her chair, studying Sterling's face. "Dr. Sterling, 24 hours ago, you called me a monkey and accused me of practicing voodoo medicine. What's changed?" Sterling winced at her words. "You saved lives. You saved my career. You saved this hospital's reputation. And you did it all after I treated you with unconscionable cruelty." "The answer isn't just giving me a job, Dr. Sterling. The answer is changing how this institution treats people who don't look like you, who don't have credentials you recognize, who see medicine differently than you do." Sterling nodded slowly. "You're right, and I want to learn how to do that." Grace opened her notebook one last time, showing him a page he hadn't seen before. It contained a list of innovations she'd developed over the years: infection prevention strategies, patient comfort techniques, environmental modifications that improved outcomes. "This is 2 years' worth of ideas I never shared because no one would listen to a janitor," Grace said. "But if you're serious about change, I have a lot to offer." Sterling studied the page, his eyes widening as he read her proposals. "These are brilliant. Why didn't you ever submit them through proper channels?" Grace's smile was sad. "Dr. Sterling, I'm a black woman with a cleaning cart. There are no proper channels for people like me." "There will be now," Sterling said quietly. Grace closed her notebook and stood to leave. "We'll see, Dr. Sterling. Tomorrow, when the crisis is over and the cameras are gone, we'll see if you remember this conversation." As she reached the door, Sterling called out, "Grace?" She turned back. "Thank you. For saving Michael. For saving all of them. And for showing me what I'd become." Grace nodded once, then disappeared into the hallway, leaving Sterling alone with the weight of everything he'd almost lost through his own prejudice and pride. The media storm hit St. Catherine's Medical Center like a Category 5 hurricane at 7 a.m. on Thursday morning. Grace Williams watched from the basement maintenance office as news vans lined up outside the hospital's main entrance, their satellite dishes reaching toward a gray Manhattan sky. Channel 7's lead health reporter stood before the camera, her voice carrying through the hospital's open windows. This is Sarah Carter reporting live from St. Catherine's Medical Center, where sources confirm a Legionnaire's disease outbreak has infected at least 12 patients, including CEO Michael Davis. Hospital administration has yet to comment on reports that the outbreak could have been prevented. Grace's radio crackled to life. All environmental services staff went to the main conference room immediately. She found Maria Santos and the rest of the cleaning crew huddled together like sheep awaiting slaughter. Robert Mitchell, the hospital's chief administrator, paced before them with the predatory energy of a man looking for someone to blame. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mitchell began, his voice sharp enough to cut glass, "this hospital is facing the worst crisis in its 150-year history. The CDC is sending investigators. The state health department is threatening to suspend our license, and the media is painting us as incompetent." He stopped pacing and faced the group directly. "I need to know if any of you observed anything unusual during the ventilation system installation last week. Any safety violations? Any concerns that weren't reported through proper channels?" Grace felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Word had spread through the hospital's informal network. The custodial staff who cleaned every room, the kitchen workers who delivered every meal, the maintenance crew who fixed every problem. They all knew she'd identified the outbreak source. "Sir," Maria Santos spoke up, her voice trembling, "Grace Williams documented several issues during the installation, but—" "Ms. Williams," Mitchell's eyes locked onto Grace with laser focus. "Step forward." Grace moved to the front of the room, her leather notebook clutched against her chest. Mitchell's smile was cold as winter. "I understand you've been playing epidemiologist, Ms. Williams, conducting unauthorized investigations, making medical recommendations without proper credentials." Mitchell's voice carried through the room like a death sentence. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've helped contain a potentially deadly outbreak," Grace replied quietly. "You've opened this hospital to massive liability," Mitchell exploded. "Your unauthorized activities, your unlicensed medical practice. Do you understand that every lawyer in the city is going to use your involvement to prove we're negligent?" The conference room door burst open, and 3 men in expensive suits strode in with the confidence of sharks smelling blood. The lead attorney, a silver-haired man with dead eyes, immediately focused on Grace. "Robert Mitchell? I'm James Whitmore from Crenshaw, Baldwin & Associates, representing Venttech Industries. We understand one of your employees has been making accusations about our client's equipment." Grace felt the walls closing in as Whitmore approached her. "Ms. Williams, isn't it? I have some questions about your qualifications to assess commercial ventilation systems." "I documented what I observed," Grace said steadily. "Ah, yes, your observations." Whitmore's smile was predatory. "Tell me, Ms. Williams, when you lost your nursing license 2 years ago for patient endangerment, did you also lose your understanding of the legal consequences of practicing medicine without a license?" The words hit Grace like physical blows. Around the room, her colleagues shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding her eyes entirely. "The patient endangerment charges were false," Grace said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Were they?" Whitmore opened a thick file folder. "According to court records, you administered an unauthorized medication that nearly killed an elderly patient. The family's testimony described gross negligence and racial bias in your treatment decisions." Grace's hands trembled with rage. "That family lied to cover their own malpractice. They gave their father medications that interacted with his prescribed treatment, then blamed me when he had complications. And yet the state medical board found sufficient evidence to revoke your license permanently," Whitmore continued relentlessly. "Now you're working as a janitor, and somehow you've convinced this hospital that your observations are medically relevant. Mitchell stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. Ms. Williams, effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you from the premises. Wait. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the room like a blade as he entered with Dr. Park and Detective Johnson. Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Williams are under the protection of an ongoing federal investigation. Detective Johnson stepped forward, his badge clearly visible. I'm Detective Marcus Johnson, NYPD Health Crimes Division, Ms. Williams has been working with our department and the CDC to investigate potential criminal negligence in the installation of this hospital's ventilation system. Whitmore's confidence faltered slightly. Detective, surely you understand that this woman has no medical credentials. What I understand, Johnson interrupted, is that Ms. Williams' documentation has provided crucial evidence in what may become a criminal case. Her observations have been corroborated by environmental testing, and her medical analysis has been reviewed and validated by multiple physicians. Grace watched the power dynamics in the room shift as Johnson continued. Furthermore, any attempt to intimidate or retaliate against Ms. Williams could be construed as obstruction of justice. Mitchell's face went pale. Detective Johnson, surely you can understand our position. This hospital's reputation will be determined by how you handle this crisis, not by scapegoating the person who identified it, Sterling interjected. He moved to stand beside Grace, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. Whitmore regrouped quickly. Dr. Sterling, while we appreciate law enforcement's interest, the fact remains that Ventec Industries followed all installation protocols. Any suggestion that our equipment caused this outbreak is purely speculative. Actually, Dr. Park spoke up, producing a tablet with test results. The CDC's preliminary findings confirm Legionella bacteria in the ventilation intake, exactly where Ms. Williams predicted we'd find it. The bacterial strain matches samples from all affected patients. Which proves nothing about our installation procedures, Whitmore shot back. Ms. Williams could have contaminated those samples herself. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Grace felt the familiar weight of being presumed guilty until proven innocent, of having her integrity questioned because of who she was rather than what she'd done. That's enough. Detective Johnson's voice carried the authority of 20 years in law enforcement. Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you advise your client to cooperate fully with this investigation. Accusations against Ms. Williams without evidence could constitute defamation. Mitchell looked between the lawyers, the detective, and the doctors, clearly calculating his next move. Dr. Sterling, regardless of the investigation, we need to consider the hospital's liability exposure. Ms. Williams' involvement complicates our position significantly. Our position, Sterling said firmly, is that we identified and contained a dangerous outbreak through the collaborative efforts of our entire team. Ms. Williams's contributions were essential to that success. Grace felt a surge of gratitude toward Sterling, but she also recognized the precarious nature of her situation. In the span of 24 hours, she'd gone from invisible janitor to key witness in a federal investigation, a position that made her both valuable and vulnerable. Gentlemen, she said, her voice cutting through the legal posturing. While you're debating liability and credentials, patients are still fighting for their lives upstairs. Michael Davis is stable but not out of danger. Mrs. Henderson is showing improvement but needs continued monitoring. Mr. Patel's respiratory function is still compromised. She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. You can question my credentials, threaten my job, or try to discredit my observations. But the bacteria doesn't care about any of that. The outbreak is real, the source has been identified, and the treatment protocol is working. Grace opened her notebook one last time, showing the room her latest entries. I documented 3 more potential cases this morning, patients showing early symptoms that fit the pattern. If you want to spend time fighting over who gets blamed, that's your choice. But I'll be upstairs watching patients and taking notes, because that's what needs to be done. She closed the notebook and faced Mitchell directly. You can suspend me if you want, Mr. Mitchell, but you can't suspend the truth. As Grace turned to leave, Detective Johnson called out, "Ms. Williams, I'll need you available for further questioning as this investigation develops." "I'll be here," Grace replied, "taking care of patients. It's what I do." The room fell silent as she walked out, leaving behind a group of powerful people forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their hospital's reputation now rested in the hands of a black woman with a mop and a notebook. Outside the conference room, Grace could hear Mitchell's voice rising in frustration, Whitmore's legal threats, and Sterling's measured responses. But her mind was already upstairs with the patients who needed someone to watch over them while the lawyers argued about liability. She had work to do. The emergency press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. in St. Catherine's main auditorium, but by noon the hospital was under siege. Grace Williams stood at the window of Michael Davis's recovery room, watching news crews multiply outside like bacteria in a petri dish. CNN, NBC, Fox News, and local stations had all converged on the medical center, turning the parking lot into a maze of satellite trucks and camera equipment. "Grace," Michael's voice was weak but clear. He'd regained consciousness that morning, though his recovery would take weeks. "I need to tell you something." She turned from the window, noting that his color had improved significantly since Dr. Sterling had implemented her treatment protocol. "You should rest, Mr. Davis. The antibiotics are working, but your body needs time to heal." "No, listen to me." Michael struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed. "I remember what happened that night. I remember you trying to help me, and I remember Sterling's response." Grace's expression remained neutral. "That's in the past now." "It's not in the past," Michael said firmly. "Because in 30 minutes, I'm going to address the media about this outbreak, and I want you there with me." "Mr. Davis, I appreciate the sentiment, but that's not a good idea. Mr. Mitchell has made it clear that my presence complicates the hospital's legal position." Michael's eyes flashed with anger. "Mitchell works for me, not the other way around. And right now, I'm more concerned with telling the truth than protecting our legal position." Before Grace could respond, Dr. Sterling entered the room with Dr. Park and Detective Johnson. Sterling's face was grim. "Grace, we need to talk. The legal team is pushing hard for you to be excluded from the press conference. They're arguing that your involvement opens the hospital to liability claims." "They're scared," Detective Johnson added bluntly. "Ventec's lawyers are threatening massive lawsuits if the hospital publicly blames their equipment. They want you silenced." Grace looked between the three people who had become her unlikely allies. "Then maybe I should step back. This isn't worth destroying the hospital's reputation." "The hell it isn't," Michael Davis said from his hospital bed. "Grace, this hospital's reputation was built on the idea that we provide the best medical care available. If we can't acknowledge when a member of our team, any member of our team, saves lives, then we don't deserve our reputation." Sterling moved closer to Grace, his voice quiet but intense. "I've been thinking about yesterday morning, about what I said to you, about how I treated you." Grace remained silent, letting him work through whatever he needed to say. "I called you an animal," Sterling continued, his voice heavy with shame. "I dismissed your expertise because of the color of your skin and your job title. I nearly let patients die because my prejudice was stronger than my medical judgment." "Dr. Sterling—" "Let me finish," he interrupted. "For 30 years, I've prided myself on being a good doctor. But yesterday, you showed me that being a good doctor means listening to wisdom wherever it comes from. And today, I'm going to make sure everyone knows that." Dr. Park stepped forward. "Grace, the CDC preliminary report credits your early detection with preventing what could have been a citywide outbreak. Your documentation methodology is already being studied as a model for environmental health surveillance." Detective Johnson nodded. "And my investigation has cleared you of any wrongdoing. In fact, your cooperation has been exemplary throughout this entire process." Grace felt overwhelmed by the support, but also wary of the public attention it would bring. "I'm not comfortable being in the spotlight. I just want to do my job." Your job is about to change, Michael said from his bed. Grace, I'm offering you the position of Director of Patient Safety and Quality Care, effective immediately. Full medical staff privileges, department budget, and the authority to implement hospital-wide safety protocols. Grace stared at him in shock. Mr. Davis, I don't have a medical license. You don't need one for this position. You need exactly what you have, the ability to see patterns, to observe what others miss, and to advocate for patients regardless of the obstacles. Sterling looked at his watch. Grace, we need to make a decision. The press conference starts in 15 minutes, and I want you on that stage with us. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. 2 days ago, she'd been invisible. Now she was being asked to step into the brightest spotlight imaginable. If I do this, she said quietly, there's no going back. The lawyers will come after me harder. The media will dig into my past. Every mistake I've ever made will be scrutinized. Let them come, Michael said firmly. We'll face it together. Grace opened her leather notebook one final time, looking at pages filled with observations, insights, and careful documentation. This book had been her lifeline for 2 years, proof that she hadn't stopped being a healer just because she'd lost her license. All right, she said finally, but we do this my way. We tell the truth, all of it, about the outbreak, about the investigation, and about what really happened that night. 20 minutes later, Grace found herself standing behind a podium in St. Catherine's main auditorium facing a sea of cameras and reporters. Dr. Sterling stood to her right, Michael Davis to her left in a wheelchair, still weak but determined to be present. Ladies and gentlemen, Sterling began, I want to introduce you to Grace Williams, whose expertise and dedication prevented what could have been a catastrophic public health crisis. The room buzzed with activity as cameras focused on Grace. She could see Robert Mitchell in the back of the room, his face pale with anxiety. Ventec's lawyers sat in the front row, ready to pounce on any statement they could use against the hospital. Grace stepped to the microphone, her notebook open in her hands. For 30 years, I've watched this hospital from every angle, as a nurse, as a patient advocate, and for the last 2 years, as the woman who cleaned up after everyone else. I've seen medicine at its best and worst. Her voice was steady, carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak. I lost my nursing license 2 years ago because a wealthy family needed someone to blame for their own mistakes. The system believed them instead of me, not because of the evidence, but because of who I was and who they were. Grace could see reporters frantically taking notes, sensing the human drama beneath the medical story. But losing my license didn't make me forget how to observe patients. It didn't stop me from caring when someone was in pain. And it didn't prevent me from recognizing the signs of an outbreak that could have killed dozens of people. She held up her notebook, the same one that had documented every crucial detail of the crisis. This book contains 20 years of observations, patterns that busy doctors missed, environmental factors that traditional medical charts don't track, patient behaviors that reveal more than blood tests sometimes can. Grace looked directly into the main camera, speaking to the millions of people who would see this broadcast. I didn't stop being a healer when I started carrying a mop. Medicine isn't just about degrees and titles. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, and caring enough to act when they need help. The room was completely silent now, every person hanging on her words. 3 days ago, Dr. Sterling called me an animal and dismissed my observations as worthless. Yesterday, those same observations helped save his career and this hospital's patients. The difference wasn't in my knowledge or my qualifications. The difference was in whether someone was willing to listen. Grace closed her notebook and looked around the auditorium. This outbreak started because corners were cut and safety protocols were ignored. It was contained because people worked together, regardless of their job titles or credentials. The lesson here isn't about medical expertise. It's about human dignity and the value of every person's contribution. She paused, letting her words sink in. I'm Grace Williams. I'm 52 years old. I'm black. I clean floors for a living, and I just helped save this hospital. If that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe you need to examine why. The auditorium erupted in questions, but Grace stepped back from the microphone. Dr. Sterling moved forward to handle the medical details, while Michael Davis addressed the administrative response. As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Grace Williams stood quietly beside the podium, her notebook clutched in her hands. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't invisible. And the world was finally listening. 6 months later, Grace Williams stood in her new office on the 5th floor of St. Catherine's Medical Center, watching the morning sun paint Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold and amber. The nameplate on her door read, Grace Williams, RN, Director of Patient Safety and Quality Care, a title that had once seemed impossible, but now felt as natural as breathing. Her leather notebook sat open on her mahogany desk, but it was no longer the secret documentation of a dismissed cleaning lady. Now it was the foundation of the Grace Protocols, a revolutionary approach to patient safety that had been adopted by hospitals across the country. The same observations that had once been ignored were now required reading for medical students at Columbia, NYU, and Mount Sinai. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Maria Santos entered, no longer wearing a cleaning uniform, but dressed in navy blue scrubs with Patient Safety Coordinator embroidered above her pocket. Grace, the morning briefing is ready, Maria said, her voice carrying a confidence that hadn't existed 6 months ago. We have 3 new environmental observations from the night shift, and Dr. Park wants to review the infection prevention protocols for the new cardiac wing. Grace smiled at the young woman who had become her first protégé. How are the new team members adjusting to the documentation requirements? Better than expected, Maria replied, consulting her tablet. The maintenance staff love having their observations taken seriously. Yesterday, Carlos identified a potential water contamination issue in the pediatric wing that could have caused problems if it had gone unnoticed. And the medical staff? Maria's grin was infectious. Dr. Martinez told me yesterday that he's learned more about patient observation in the past 6 months than in all of medical school. He said having environmental health coordinators working alongside clinical staff has revolutionized how they think about patient care. Grace stood and walked to the window, looking down at the hospital's entrance where patients and families moved in and out with purpose and hope. No longer did she see these hallways as places where she was invisible. Now she saw them as her domain, a place where every voice mattered, where every observation could save a life. Grace? Maria's voice carried a note of excitement. Dr. Sterling wants to see you in conference room A. He says it's important. Grace made her way through corridors that had once been scenes of humiliation, but were now filled with colleagues who greeted her by name, who sought her input, who respected her expertise. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been resistance from some board members, skepticism from physicians set in their ways, and ongoing legal battles with vent tech industries. But truth had a way of winning when people were brave enough to speak it. She entered conference room A to find Dr. Sterling waiting with Dr. Park, Detective Johnson, and a woman she didn't recognize, an elegant African-American woman in her 60s wearing a perfectly tailored suit. Grace, Sterling said, rising as she entered, I'd like you to meet Dr. Vivian Carter, Chief Medical Officer at Mount Sinai Hospital. Dr. Carter extended her hand with a warm smile. Ms. Williams, it's an honor to meet you. Your work here has created quite a stir in the medical community. Grace accepted the handshake, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that spoke of a woman accustomed to commanding respect in rooms full of powerful men. Dr. Carter has a proposal for you, Sterling continued. But first, I wanted to share some news. He opened a folder on the conference table, revealing official-looking documents. The New York State Board of Medical Licensing has completed their review of your case from 2 years ago. Based on new evidence and testimony from the investigation, they've officially overturned the decision to revoke your nursing license. Grace felt the room spin slightly. They're reinstating my license? With a formal apology, Dr. Park added, her voice filled with satisfaction. The board found that the original hearing was biased and that the evidence against you was fabricated. You're officially a registered nurse again, Grace. Detective Johnson spoke up from his corner of the room. The criminal investigation into the family that accused you has resulted in charges of fraud and perjury. Justice has a way of catching up with people who think they're untouchable. Grace sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was hearing. After 2 years of carrying the shame of a false accusation, her professional reputation was finally restored. There's more, Dr. Carter said gently. Grace, Mount Sinai wants to offer you the position of Chief Director of Environmental Health and Patient Safety for our entire hospital system. It would involve overseeing patient safety protocols at 12 hospitals across New York and New Jersey. Grace looked around the room at faces that had become dear to her. Sterling, who had transformed from antagonist to champion. Park, who had never stopped believing in her. Johnson, who had ensured justice was served. And through the window, she could see Maria coordinating with the environmental health team Grace had built from the ground up. It's an incredible opportunity, Grace said carefully. But I need to ask, why now? 6 months ago, I was mopping floors and being called an animal. What's changed? Dr. Carter leaned forward, her expression serious. What's changed, Grace, is that the medical community has finally acknowledged what you've always known, that healing requires listening to wisdom wherever it comes from. Your protocols have prevented outbreaks at 4 different hospitals in the past 6 months. Your documentation methods have been adopted by the CDC as a national standard. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But more than that, you've shown us that expertise doesn't always come with the credentials we expect. You've proven that someone who's been dismissed and marginalized can still change an entire industry. Grace stood and walked to the window again, looking down at the hospital entrance where her journey had begun 6 months ago. She thought about Michael Davis, who had recovered fully and become one of her strongest advocates. She thought about Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Patel and all the other patients whose lives had been saved because someone finally listened. Dr. Carter, Grace said, turning back to face the room. Your offer is generous, and I'm honored by your confidence in my work. But I need to decline. The room fell silent. My work here isn't finished, Grace continued. We've built something special at St. Catherine's, a culture where every person's observations matter, where patient safety comes before institutional politics, where dignity isn't determined by job titles. She looked at Sterling, who was watching her with something approaching paternal pride. Dr. Sterling offered me something more valuable than any position at another hospital. He offered me the chance to change the place that once tried to destroy me, to transform an institution from the inside out. Grace picked up her leather notebook from the conference table, running her fingers over its worn cover. This book started as the secret observations of a woman who'd been made invisible. Now it's the foundation of protocols that are saving lives across the country. But the real transformation isn't in the protocols, it's in the people. She looked around the room at faces that reflected respect, admiration, and something deeper, the recognition of shared humanity. 6 months ago, this hospital was a place where people like me were dismissed, ignored, treated as less than human. Today, it's a place where every voice matters, where a maintenance worker's observation carries the same weight as a department head's opinion, where patients are seen as whole human beings, not just collections of symptoms. Grace opened her notebook to a page she'd written just that morning. I've been documenting our progress, and the results speak for themselves. 0 healthcare-associated infections in 6 months. Patient satisfaction scores at an all-time high. Staff turnover down 60%. Most importantly, we've created a culture of respect that extends far beyond medical care. Dr. Carter nodded slowly. I understand your decision, Grace, and I respect it, but the offer stands if you ever change your mind. Thank you, Grace replied, but I found my calling here. After the meeting ended and the visitors had left, Grace found herself alone with Dr. Sterling in the conference room where she'd once laid out her 5 conditions for sharing her knowledge. Any regrets? Sterling asked quietly. Grace considered the question. About staying? No. About the journey that brought us here? That's more complicated. She looked at the man who had once called her subhuman and now championed her work throughout the medical community. Dr. Sterling, can I ask you something? Of course. What would have happened if Michael Davis had died that night? If the outbreak had spread and people had died because you refused to listen to me? Sterling was quiet for a long moment, his face reflecting the weight of the question. I would have destroyed lives through my arrogance and prejudice, he said finally. I would have proven that degrees and credentials mean nothing without wisdom and humility. And now? Now I spend every day trying to be worthy of the second chance you gave me, to be the kind of doctor who listens instead of dismisses, who leads with compassion instead of ego. Grace smiled and stood to leave. That's all any of us can do, Dr. Sterling. Learn from our mistakes and try to do better. As she reached the door, Sterling called out, Grace? She turned back. Thank you for saving Michael. For saving this hospital, for saving me from becoming someone I couldn't live with. Grace nodded once and stepped into the hallway, where Maria was waiting with the afternoon patient safety reports. Ready for rounds? Maria asked, falling into step beside her mentor. Always, Grace replied, opening her notebook to a fresh page. Together, they walked through the halls of St. Catherine's Medical Center, past patients and families, doctors and nurses, maintenance workers and administrators. In this place that had once tried to make Grace invisible, she was now the beating heart of an institution transformed. Her leather notebook was no longer a secret. Her observations were no longer dismissed. Her voice was no longer silenced. Grace Williams had found her way home. As the afternoon sun streamed through the hospital's windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors she had once cleaned in darkness, Grace Williams continued her rounds. She watched, she listened, she documented, and she cared, because that's what healers do. And Grace Williams had never stopped being a healer. She had just learned to heal in ways she never expected, not just individual patients, but entire institutions, broken systems, and wounded souls who had forgotten that every person deserves dignity, respect, and the chance to be heard. In her notebook that evening, Grace wrote, Day 183 post-implementation. Culture change is measurable not just in infection rates and patient satisfaction, but in the sound of laughter in hallways that once echoed with fear. In maintenance workers who speak up about safety concerns without hesitation. In doctors who ask questions instead of assuming they have all the answers. In the knowledge that wisdom can come from anywhere, and healing happens when we learn to see each other as fully human. She closed the notebook and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new observations, new opportunities to prove that justice served with dignity and grace could transform the world, one person at a time. In her notebook that evening, Grace wrote, Day 183 post-implementation. Culture change is measurable not just in infection rates and patient satisfaction, but in the sound of laughter in hallways that once echoed with fear. In maintenance workers who speak up about safety concerns without hesitation. In doctors who ask questions instead of assuming they have all the answers. In the knowledge that wisdom can come from anywhere, and healing happens when we learn to see each other as fully human. She closed the notebook and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new observations, new opportunities to prove that justice served with dignity and grace could transform the world, one person at a time. Grace Williams proved that wisdom doesn't always come with the credentials we expect. Today, really see someone who's usually invisible, and listen to their story. Hit like if this moved you, subscribe for more incredible true stories, and remember, every person deserves dignity, regardless of their job title. Justice for Grace. Every voice matters, because the next Grace Williams might be right in front of you.